The day my mother's estate was settled. Everyone in that room already assumed they knew how it would end. My brother had built his life around that assumption. So had most of our extended family. I was the only one who hadn't thought about it much. Because for the 4 years my mother was sick, I was too busy making sure she was still alive to think about what she might leave behind. My mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's in her late 60s. It moved slowly at first, the way those things do. A tremor in her right hand, some stiffness in the mornings, a few stumbles she laughed off. She was stubborn in the way a lot of women from her generation are. She didn't want help. She didn't want to be a burden. She told me she was fine until the evening I called, and she couldn't remember how to turn off the stove. I drove 4 hours from Toronto to her house in Kingston that same night. My brother, he lived 40 minutes away from her, in Ottawa, called me the next morning to ask what I'd found out. I told him about the stove. I told him she'd also forgotten the name of her neighbor, a woman she'd had tea with every Thursday for 11 years. He said he'd try to get out there on the weekend. He didn't make it that weekend. Or the next one. I'm not going to pretend I was some kind of saint about it. I was frustrated. I had a job I cared about. I worked as a project coordinator for a nonprofit arts organization. Not exactly a high salary, but meaningful work. I had an apartment I loved in the east end of the city. I had a life. When I started driving to Kingston every other weekend, then every weekend, then eventually most weekdays, that life got smaller and smaller, until I barely recognized what was left of it. My brother, in the meantime, had spent those same years building his financial planning practice into something genuinely impressive. He had a corner office downtown. He had a house in a neighborhood with good schools. He had the kind of stability that my mother used to reference in conversation. Not to be cruel, I don't think, but because she was proud of him. Your brother really landed on his feet, she used to say. I don't think she meant anything by it. But it landed in a particular way when I was driving home at midnight after helping her into bed. Still in my work clothes, eating a gas station sandwich. By the time I eventually gave up my apartment and moved into her house full-time, my brother had visited 11 times in 4 years. I counted, not to be petty. I was keeping a kind of journal during that period, documenting her care needs for the home care agency that came 3 mornings a week. The visits were in there. 11 times in 4 years, usually around the holidays, usually with his wife and their 2 kids, which meant the visits were cheerful and busy, and about 15 minutes of actual time with Mom before the kids needed snacks or someone needed the bathroom. He always arrived with something, a fruit basket, a gift card to the local pharmacy. Once, a very nice throw blanket that she genuinely loved and kept on her chair until the end. He was generous in the ways that were easy to be generous. What he couldn't give was time. He said the practice demanded it. He said he wished he could do more. He probably meant it. Mom passed in February. It was a Tuesday. It had snowed heavily overnight and the plows hadn't come through yet, and I had to call her doctor from the kitchen while looking out at the untouched driveway, watching the neighbor's cat walk across it and leave tiny prints. I don't know why I remember that so specifically. The mind does strange things in those moments. The funeral brought everyone together. Cousins I hadn't seen since her 65th birthday. An aunt who had moved to Victoria and called twice a year. My brother's family, of course, and my brother himself. Composed and organized, the way he always was, helping coordinate the catering for the reception, greeting people at the door, looking exactly like someone who had been present and involved. He was good at those big moments. Always had been. A few weeks later, we sat down in the office of her estate lawyer in Kingston. The room was small and a little overheated. There was a window that looked out onto a parking garage. My brother sat across from me with his wife beside him. A few relatives had come along. My mother's younger sister, one of my cousins. Nobody said much. My brother seemed relaxed, confident in a way that didn't quite fit the occasion. On the drive there, he'd mentioned, casually, that he'd been thinking about what to do with the house. He had some ideas about the property. He knew a developer, the lawyer. A quiet man in his 60s named Fentham arranged a series of documents on the table and put on his reading glasses. He had the unhurried manner of someone who had done this thousands of times and understood that patience was part of the job. He read through the standard language first, the RSPs, the small accounts, a piece of jewelry left to my aunt. Then he got to the main assets. The family home and property at 14 Lakeview Crescent, Kingston, shall pass to my son. My brother nodded slowly. My financial accounts, after fees and taxes, shall be distributed equally between my two children. I said nothing. I looked at my hands. The house was the significant asset. The property had been in the family for 30 years, and the neighborhood had changed considerably. It was worth something real. The accounts, split in half, would be modest. My brother looked at me across the table, with an expression I can only describe as careful. Like he was trying not to smile too visibly. He said, "Mom always knew you were more of a city person anyway." He said it gently, like a comfort. Like he was doing me a favor. My cousin shifted in her chair. My aunt looked out the window. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, quiet enough that it might have been a joke between just the two of us, but loud enough that everyone heard. 4 years, and this is what it amounts to. Maybe you should have spent less time hovering and more time figuring out your own finances. Nobody laughed. One of his kids, who'd come along for reasons I still don't understand, asked for water. The room was entirely still. Mr. Fentham set down the document he was holding. He took off his glasses. He placed them on the table with a small deliberate sound. Then he looked up. "There is a second document," he said. "Your mother asked me to hold it separately. She was very specific about the order in which these matters were to be addressed." My brother turned toward the lawyer. The easiness in his face was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Mr. Fentham opened a smaller envelope. The kind you'd use for a personal letter, cream-colored, with my mother's handwriting on the outside. He unfolded 2 pages. "She asked that I read this aloud," he said. "Those were her instructions." He began. "To my children. If you are reading this, then I'm gone. And I suspect the two of you are sitting in an overheated office, trying not to look at each other. I know you both better than you think I do. I want to say some things while I still can, or rather, while you still have to sit quietly and listen." A few people in the room made small involuntary sounds. My aunt pressed her hand over her mouth. "I love my son. He built something I'm proud of. He has a family I adore. He worked hard and it showed. But working hard at a distance is still a distance. I don't say that to wound him. I say it because it is the truth, and I have spent enough of my life being diplomatic." My brother's expression had gone very still. My daughter gave up 4 years of her life for me. I watched her do it. I watched her drive in from Toronto in December ice storms. I watched her cancel trips she'd planned, quietly, without complaining to me, because she didn't want me to feel guilty. I watched her cry in the driveway once when she thought I was asleep. I was not asleep. I was watching through the window. I have thought about that moment almost every day since. I had forgotten that. Completely forgotten it. I'd had a hard phone call that night with my then-boyfriend, who had grown tired of the situation. I'd gone outside and sat on the front step in the cold and cried, and then come back inside. I thought I'd been alone. She had seen me. Mr. Fentham turned the page. "There is something I did not tell either of my children. 3 years ago, I was approached about a matter connected to the property. I want to explain it here because I want the explanation to come from me, not from paperwork." My brother sat forward very slightly. When the city of Kingston expanded its waterfront revitalization plan, the properties on Lakeview Crescent were assessed as part of a Heritage Corridor designation study. The house qualifies for designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. I applied for the designation myself, with the help of Mr. Fentham, 2 years ago. It was approved 18 months ago. I did not mention this to anyone. The lawyer set down the letter for a moment and removed a second document from his folder. He placed it on the table. It was a letter on City of Kingston letterhead. Even upside down, I could see the official seal. "What does that mean?" my brother asked. His voice had changed. It was smaller. Mr. Fentham folded his hands. A heritage designation under the Act means the property carries certain protections and also certain opportunities. A developer cannot simply acquire and demolish a designated property without a complicated and lengthy process. However, and your mother anticipated this, a designated heritage property is also eligible for a specific provincial conservation easement, which generates a tax credit arrangement and, in this case, an offer. He produced another sheet. The Frontenac Heritage Foundation, in partnership with a provincial housing trust, has made a formal offer to purchase the property with the intention of preserving and operating it as part of a community heritage housing initiative. The offer price. He paused and looked at it, though I think he already knew the number, is considerably higher than the current assessed market value. The offer is conditional on the property transferring to the next of kin, which it now has. How much higher? My brother said. Mr. Fentham told him. My aunt made a sound I will not try to describe. My cousin stared at the table. My brother's wife put her hand on the folder in front of her as if steadying herself. That's not possible, my brother said. The documentation is all here, Mr. Fentham said calmly. Your mother worked on this quietly for 2 years. She understood what she was doing. She had it verified by an independent appraiser and a heritage law specialist. The offer is real. He picked up the letter again. I did not choose my daughter over my son. I want that to be clear. I chose to give each of them what I believed they had actually earned. My son built a successful life. He doesn't need the house. My daughter gave me the end of mine. She deserves a beginning. I could not see the table anymore. My vision had gone blurry in that embarrassing way that happens when you're trying very hard not to cry in a professional setting. The property and its opportunities passed to my daughter because I trust her to make something of it. Not because she was obedient or dutiful or any of those diminishing words. Because she showed up. Every single day. When it was inconvenient. When it was heartbreaking. When there was no applause and no reward, and no indication from anyone that it would ever be acknowledged. Mr. Fentham set the letter down. She saw me, he finished. I want her to know that I saw her too. The room was completely silent. Outside, through the parking garage window, I could hear a car alarm going off in the distance. My brother did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was to ask Mr. Fentham a procedural question about the timeline of the offer. Something practical, something that put a task in front of him, which I understood. He needed something to do with his hands. I recognized that impulse. His wife was looking at him, not unkindly, but steadily. My aunt reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There were more documents after that. The actual mechanics of the heritage offer, the provincial paperwork, a letter from the Frontenac Foundation outlining next steps. Mr. Fentham walked us through everything with the same quiet efficiency. I signed things. I nodded. I probably looked like someone who was processing at about 30% capacity. At one point, my brother said quietly, and without looking at me directly, that he hadn't known about the designation. I said I hadn't either. That was all we said to each other in that room. It wasn't anger. Exactly. Or if it was anger, it was the complicated kind that's tangled up with grief, and something like shame and something else I don't have a word for. He'd spent 4 years believing the story he had about our family. He wasn't the villain of it, in his version. He was the successful one, the provider, the person who had made something of himself. That's a hard story to watch rewrite itself in real time. I don't know what he thought on the drive home. I drove back to Kingston alone. I'd come separately. And I sat in the driveway of my mother's house for a long time. Her house. My house now. The front step where I'd cried and thought I was invisible. She'd been watching through the window. I keep returning to that. Of all the things she said in that letter, and she said a lot, my mother was not a woman who did things halfway. That's the detail that stays with me. That she saw me. Not the years of caregiving. Not the drives. Not the medications or the insurance paperwork, or the 6 months I spent relearning my own sleeping schedule around hers. Just She was watching through the window, and she knew. There's a particular loneliness in caregiving that's hard to explain to people who haven't done it. It's not that no one is grateful or that no one cares. It's that the work is invisible by design. You show up, you handle things, you make sure the difficult parts stay behind closed doors because the person you're caring for still has dignity, and you want to protect it. Nobody sees the 2 a.m. bathroom trips or the medication spreadsheets or the careful negotiation required when someone is losing independence and doesn't want to admit it. They see the fruit basket. They see the nice throw blanket. They see what's easy to see. Moms all saw the rest. The Heritage Foundation was patient with me through the months that followed. I had a lot to learn about the designation process, about the easement terms, about what the offer actually meant in practical terms versus theoretical ones. I hired a lawyer of my own. I talked to a financial advisor for the first time in my life. I took my time. My brother and I didn't speak for about 3 months after the reading. It wasn't a dramatic falling out. There was no confrontation, no phone call where things were said that couldn't be unsaid. It was more like we both needed to sit with what had happened and figure out what to do with it. He called, eventually. We talked for a long time. He said things I appreciated. I said things I think he needed to hear. We're still figuring it out. His comment in the lawyer's office, the one about hovering, about my finances, doesn't occupy a lot of space in my head anymore. I understand where it came from. He was embarrassed, and when he's embarrassed, he deflects into competence talk, financial talk, the language of people who measure worth in practical outcomes. He's always been like that. I used to let it make me feel small. It doesn't anymore. The foundation finalized the purchase 6 months after the reading. I won't share the specific number here. It's not the point, and honestly, it still makes me a little dizzy when I think about it directly. What I'll say is that my mother was right. She understood what that property was worth in ways that none of us had bothered to find out. While my brother was calling it an outdated bungalow in a neighborhood that had seen better days, she was quietly having it assessed, designated, and prepared. She was sick, and she was tired, and her hands shook, and she still did all of that. Without telling anyone. Without making it about herself. I cried more in the months after the reading than I did right after she died. Grief does that sometimes. Waits until you're no longer in survival mode, then catches up. I'd been in survival mode for 4 years. When it finally ended, everything hit at once. But underneath it was something else. Something I hadn't expected to feel. She'd been watching. She knew. And at the end of everything, she made sure I knew too that she knew. That's not a small thing. In fact, for me, it turned out to be the largest thing of all. I still live in Kingston. I rent a little place not far from where her house stood. The foundation has done careful work on it. They've maintained the exterior, restored some original features, made it part of a program that's genuinely useful to the community. I walk past it sometimes. It doesn't make me sad the way I expected. It makes me feel like something was honored properly. My brother comes to visit occasionally. His kids have gotten older and are slightly less chaotic at the dinner table. His wife makes a point of being warm to me in a way that I think is her own kind of acknowledgement. We don't talk about the reading directly. We probably won't, not in any deep way. Some things in families are more useful as shared background than as ongoing conversation. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in my apartment in the evening and the light is doing that particular February thing it does in Kingston, going golden and then gray in about 20 minutes, I think about my mother at her kitchen window. I think about her watching me on that step. I think about her deciding, that same night or sometime after, that she was going to make sure it counted. She was not a dramatic person. She didn't believe in grand gestures. She believed in paying attention, in showing up for the things that mattered, in doing the work that needed doing without expecting anyone to hand you a trophy for it. She also believed, it turned out, in making things right. I got that from her. I just didn't know it was something she'd arranged to give me.